Today's meeting is Black Lives Matter, Race, Class and Revolt in the US. Our speaker is going to be Brian Richardson, who is the editor of Unity magazine and also Say It Loud, which is our book here. So Brian is going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and contributions, after which Brian will sum up for about 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian now.
Thanks very much, Saba, and good morning, everyone. Comrades and friends, one of the most dramatic developments of the final years of the Obama presidency in the United States was the eruption of a whole series of protests on the streets of America under the banner of Black Lives Matter. The catalyst for that being a whole series of brutal deaths, predominantly of black men, but also black women, at the hands of the police, including Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner. Now, as you were taking your seats, you may have noticed that there were two pieces of music that were being played, and I wasn't playing them simply as background music, although unfortunately the sound wasn't loud enough for you to be able to hear them that well. They were playing for a particular reason. The first track that I played is a track by Kendrick Lamar called from his award-winning album To Pimp a Butterfly. And it's a song called All Right, which in many ways was the anthem of many of the protests that we saw in America over the last couple of years, in 2015 and 16. The second track that I played was a much older piece of music by an artist called KRS-One. That song was written way back in 1993, and it fits with the piece of film that I was showing you, because that was footage not of a recent act of police brutality, but of the savage beating of Rodney King back in 1991. And it was that arrest and those events that led to the charging of those police officers, not surprisingly their acquittal, despite the clear evidence of the brutality that they meted out to a man who was defenceless and on the floor. And as a consequence of that acquittal, you had the eruption of riots in Los Angeles in 1992. Widely believed, of course, that because of the savagery and the injustice that amounted to, that consequently a few years later, when O.J. Simpson went on trial for the murder of his estranged wife and her lover, widely believed that the black community stood in solidarity with him and would not convict him because they simply do not accept it's possible for black people to receive justice. They could easily believe that he was fitted up for that crime. And I think KRS-One's track is particularly brilliant, because not least because it captured the events of 1991, but in fact it captures the whole history of police brutality way back to the origins of the United States and its original sin, slavery. And so, I hope you'll bear with me. I will attempt, since you couldn't hear it, I won't attempt to rap it, promise you. What I will do is I'll just read some of the lines which I think cleverly capture that. He says, "Yeah, officer from overseer, you need a little clarity, check the similarity. The overseer had the right to get ill, and if you fought back, the overseer had the right to kill. The officer has a right to arrest, and if you fight back, they'll put a hole in your chest." Back in 1993, he wrote that song about events dating back hundreds of years, and clearly, as the events of recent years indicate, something that is still going on. Now, of course, the existence of documentary footage of the everyday harassment of black people was rare in the 1990s, but the proliferation of smartphones means that it's much easier to capture those things today, and precisely because such brutality is so widespread, more and more people in black communities are determined to capture and broadcast these atrocities. The very reason why we know that Eric Garner gasped, "I can't breathe," 11 times whilst he was being fatally choked to death in Staten Island in 2014, is because that incident was filmed by a passerby. Similarly, it was an onlooker's camera which captured the fact that just 2 seconds had elapsed between the arrival of police officer Timothy Lehman on the scene and the fatal shooting of Tamir Rice, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, playing with a toy gun in Cleveland in November 2014. Now, any hope that this increased surveillance of the police would lead to them tempering their behaviour is completely misplaced. In response, really, to the growth of Black Lives Matter, papers like the Washington Post and the Guardian have taken to documenting the number of deaths that occur at the hands of the police, and in 2016 they recorded that there were 1,093, a hugely disproportionate number of which were of black men. Bear with me, I'm going to try and show you another piece of footage.
Taking the sound off.
Yeah, no, we want the sound off for now. I do apologise in advance if you're offended by this. Now, the death of Philando Castile, and that was it, was that was in Minnesota in July of last year, and that was one of the sparks for the round of protests that we saw in the summer of last year. And as you can see, Castile had been ordered to stop for having a broken tail light. He told the police, when he was told to produce his license, he told them that he had a shotgun with him, and therefore he made it clear that he had that. And they told him not to pull it out, and as you can see, fired shots which killed him. The aftermath of that was captured by his partner Diamond Reynolds, who had their 4-year-old daughter in the car with her. She politely said to him, "Please don't say you've just done that. Please don't tell me you've just shot at my boyfriend, sir," as her boyfriend lay motionless and dying in the front seat of the car. Last month, that officer, Geronimo Yanez, faced trial for manslaughter. In his testimony, and just from the little bit of footage you saw, you can decide for yourselves whether you think this was the case. He claimed that he was frightened, that he thought he was going to die, and that he had no choice but to engage with Philando Castile in the way that he did. Surprise, surprise, he was found not guilty. Now, there are a number of interesting books about what's going on at the moment. Perhaps the most well written is Keeanga Yamata Taylor's book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And what she does, I think, particularly well is capture and highlight the fact that what we've witnessed in the criminal justice system is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what, these events is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the treatment of black people in the criminal justice system and American society more generally. Just to give you a few statistics, America accounts for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. There are more than 1 million African Americans in prison. A third of black men up to the age of, I think, either 24 or 30 are somehow caught up in the criminal justice system, either in prison, on parole, a waiting sentence or whatever. Black people are incarcerated at a rate 6 times greater than that of their white counterparts. And really those are the reasons why the kind of liberal talk that you shouldn't talk about Black Lives Matter, but instead should talk about all lives matter, is really, I think, liberal nonsense. There is something very particular going on, something particular, and partly it's impossible to understand and explain without acknowledging the impact of the so-called war on drugs. I don't have time to examine it in great detail here, but in short, the particular origins of the police brutality that culminate in encounters like these lies in a very deliberate and cynical decision that was taken by Republican presidents, Nixon and Reagan in particular, to systematically launch a war on drugs initiative. They did so not because they were interested in protecting people from drugs use. Their agencies bear particular responsibility in many respects for flooding many areas with drugs. It's a hypocritical war on drugs, but it was launched quite deliberately to try and drive back the gains of the anti-Vietnam War and the civil rights movements of the 1960s. To quote one of Nixon's key advisors at the time, this is a quote that I think is in the brilliant film 13th by Ada DuVernay that you should see. He says, "It was an excuse to target the anti-war left and black people. The Nixon campaign in 68 had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or against black people, but by getting people to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalising them both heavily, we could disrupt their communities." And so it was that Nixon introduced the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970. In 1973, they launched the US Drug Enforcement Administration and declared drug abuse public enemy #1. Reagan followed this up with the shift of emphasis away from heroin towards crack cocaine. Now, I'm no scientist. I don't want to bamboozle you with science, but one thing that I do know, and it's important to recognise, is that in molecular terms, crack cocaine and powder cocaine are virtually identical. And in fact, paper research by a US agency called Vocative indicates that cocaine abuse, powder cocaine abuse, is greater than crack cocaine abuse. 12% of Americans acknowledge that they've used powder cocaine, 4% acknowledge that they've taken crack, and yet there was a time when sentencing for crack cocaine possession, supply and so on was 100 times greater than powder cocaine use and supply. Now, since then, I have to be fair, a Fair Sentencing Act has been passed in 2010, but that still means there is an 18-to-1 disparity in sentencing. In other words, an offender who is in possession would need to be in possession of 18 grams of cocaine to get the same sentence as someone who has 1 gram of crack cocaine. And the reason for that disparity is very simple. Powder cocaine is overwhelmingly the drug of the rich, college fraternity boys and so on, in their dorms, whereas crack is the drug of the poor, black and low-income people. And so, that war on drugs is something that virtually every subsequent presidential administration has endorsed and tightened up, giving more and more, stronger equipment to police forces to enforce it and so on. So, in many respects, that war on drugs forms the background to many of the encounters that culminate in these kind of violent arrests and deaths. One of the most influential, one of the best books that really captures this scandal is Michelle Alexander's book. It describes a situation where really, in ghetto areas, black kids automatically, they see the police turning up and they just automatically assume the position up against the wall, arms and legs spread eagled, expecting to be stopped and frisks. And it's those, of course, kind of violent and intimate intrusions that is simply a daily part of the experience of ghetto youth, which lead to these kind of atrocities. Alexander's book is called The New Jim Crow because she argues that what we're witnessing is the reimposition of a system of white supremacy, the system that was dominant in the southern states for many decades from the end of the 19th century, a vicious cycle whereby blacks disproportionately stopped and frisked, as is the term used over there, disproportionately charged, disproportionately sentenced, as I've indicated. You're forced to work essentially as a slave in prison for a pittance, sentenced to these 3 strikes and you're out rule, so that if having committed one offence, if you commit subsequent offences, you get these massive, sometimes life sentences for minor misdemeanours, which means that you simply cannot escape the prison system. Even if you haven't committed a number of offences, you find it impossible to find work because you have to tick the box indicating that you've committed a felony. So you're forced back into a life of crime, which of course forces you back into prison. You have your rights to vote taken away from you, and so on. So her argument that what you're seeing is the incremental reimposition of Jim Crow style supremacy, I think is a very persuasive one. It is one, however, with which I think that there is a problem, because you cannot explain what has happened you cannot explain why it is that, for example, Barack Obama can win the American presidency, not once but twice, with tens of millions of votes from white voters. If you believe that what we're seeing is simply the reimposition of white supremacy. It's an analysis that underestimates the role that the development of a black middle class has played. And I think, therefore, it cannot explain why a Black Lives Matter movement has emerged at this particular moment in history. Think about it. Things were supposed to get better during the presidency of Barack Obama. It appeared as if he had broken the mould, didn't he, when he came to office, when he won the presidency in 2008, with that fantastically simple but inspirational rallying cry, "Yes, we can," beating Hillary Clinton, the establishment Democrat candidate. And what could, in a sense, symbolise the great achievement of the civil rights movement more than the sight of Jesse Jackson, the man who had been with Martin Luther King when he was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, who cradled the dying King's head, and who then appeared on TV the following day wearing the same blood-stained jumper, saying he was going to carry on King's legacy, who himself stood for unsuccessfully for the presidency twice in the 1980s. What could symbolise the achievement of that dream more than the sight of him in Grant Park, Chicago, on the night of Obama's election, in tears? It really did seem to symbolise the passing of the baton. And As he accepted the presidency on that night, Obama himself quite deliberately echoed the final brilliant mountaintop speech that King made, and it's worth quoting. He said, "The road will be long, our climb will be steep. We may not get there in 1 year or even 1 term, but America, I have never been more hopeful than I am tonight that we will get there. I promise you, we as a people will get there." Very much echoing the words of King. And he said, "This victory is your victory. You didn't just do this to win an election, and I know that you didn't just do it for me." Very fine words, but alas, as Taylor has indicates very brilliantly in her book, the reality is that under Obama's presidency, the predicament of African Americans has got worse, more than twice as likely to be unemployed than their white counterparts. The net worth of white households is 13 times that of black households. Black life expectancy 4 times lower than that of white Americans. And now, you hear such grim statistics, and it's tempting to conclude, I think, that absolutely nothing has, not only, either that nothing has changed at all, or that Alexander's analysis, that what we're seeing is the reimposition of white supremacy, is right. I think the truth is rather more complex than that. The activists who established and participated in the civil rights and black power movement struggles shouldn't simply be applauded for their courage, or on the other hand criticised for their naivety in thinking that you could achieve black liberation in an irretrievably racist society. The reality is that they fought for and achieved a great deal, the passage of equal rights legislation, but they didn't simply stop at that. The civil rights movement grew over into a more militant black power movement in the late 1960s, precisely because those activists didn't simply accept that we've now achieved equal rights legislation and therefore we don't need to do any more. The likes of Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement continue to struggle for real equality. King himself, often criticised for being a compromiser and so on, we should remember that King died in 1968 at a time when he was increasingly critical of the Vietnam War, and on that very occasion of his death was in Memphis in order to support sanitation workers' strikes. In other words, realising the need for an economic struggle rather than simply the achievement of formal political equality. The outcome of those struggles was tangible. By the beginning of the 1970s, half of black male and 60% of black female college graduates had gained employment in the public sector, precisely because they had fought for their space in American society. By comparison with 1964, the year that the Civil Rights Act was passed, in that year there were just 100 black elected officials across the whole of the United States. By 1990, there were over 7,000. Real, tangible achievements. And when I say 7,000 elected officials, people, we're not talking, parish councillors or anything like that. You're talking, to quote Taylor, African Americans were handed the keys to some of the largest and most important cities: Los Angeles, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. But in addition to that, between 1970 and 2006, the number of black households earning more than 100,000 had grown from 1% to 9%. In other words, a significant black middle class. And so it was that you had a situation where Ron Brown became the first Commerce Secretary of under Bill Clinton's administration. Colin Powell was first the National Security Advisor, and then not the National Security Advisor, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the second most senior military position, and then Secretary of State. He only served 1 term because he then handed the baton over to Condoleezza Rice, formerly National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State, and who incidentally, of course, was somebody who went to school with the 4 girls who were massacred in 1964 in the Birmingham church bombing. So in those circumstances, you can't simply describe what has happened as the re-establishment of white supremacy. In a way, the fact that the rallying cry of today's movement is Black Lives Matter speaks volumes for the fact that something more complicated has happened, and in a sense it is an indictment of the idea of simply putting black faces into high places and thinking that that will achieve black liberation. Now, what I don't want you to think is that what I'm saying is that the people who moved into these positions of power and authority deliberately did so in order to betray their black lower class brethren. You know, they did so in order, they believed, to make a difference. They thought that being in those positions they could make a difference. They proved incapable of doing so for a whole number of reasons, not simply their own incompetence. You look at Obama himself, you read his book, The Audacity of Hope, which is subtitled Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream. They bought into the idea that there is such a thing as an American dream, and that if you got the right people into the right position, then blacks could have their fair share of it. But interestingly, and this relates to the war on drugs issue, they believed that the kind of people who were touting drugs, who were involved in, petty crime, prostitution and so on, were a scourge on the community, that they were part of the problem that needed to be flushed out. And therefore you can begin to see why it is that this layer of people, as increasingly they became governors or police chiefs or district attorneys, began to see those people as being a problem that needed to be flushed out, and therefore they supported the war on drugs initiatives, they supported the tougher sentences and so on. The kind of moralistic argument goes something like this. How could black people achieve their freedom, their equality, their liberation if they're strung out on drugs, or if they're touting drugs to their fellow citizens, or if they're abusing their own bodies or abusing the bodies of other people through the sex trade and so on. So these people, as they became governors, mayors, district attorneys and so on, supported, encouraged, developed in some senses the tough on-crime policies that culminate in these kinds of atrocities. And so an excellent book that has just come out, which in some senses is a rejoinder to Michelle Alexander's, is this book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Foreman. He says, he hates the King speech. Not the speech that Dr. King gave in August 1963, that's a brilliant speech. The King speech that he hates is the one that is delivered time and time again by judges to the young black men who he was a public defender, the speech that is delivered to them, the speech that goes something along the lines of, our generation fought to give you people opportunities. Think of the sacrifices that the civil rights leaders went through, all those marches, the sit-ins and so on. We didn't do it in order to give you the opportunity to sell drugs, to get involved in petty crime and so on. And they deliver these speeches as they're about to send these young black men to prison, probably for the rest of their lives. So in other words, the mass incarceration, they are complicit in the mass incarceration of their black brethren. And it is the fury and anger and frustration of the people who are at the receiving end of that oppression that I think explains why it is at this particular moment a Black Lives Matter movement has erupted. After 40 odd years of betrayal, increasingly at the hands of their own folk, the people who are supposed to have lifted others as they rose, culminating in an Obama presidency that simply fails to deliver for the majority of black Americans, in which, you know, the criminalisation of black communities increases rather than goes down. That, I think, helps to explain why it is that you have a movement erupting on the streets at this particular time. So how long have I got? 5 minutes. I need to rush. So having said that, let's look at, now of course Obama's gone and we're living in the era of Donald Trump, the 45th president. I don't need to tell you that Donald J. Trump is no friend of black communities. You know, he having had no real interest in politics, he came to prominence as a Republican politician, as really the head of the birther movement, arguing that Barack Obama isn't a true-born American and therefore shouldn't really be allowed to be the presidency. And there is no sign that the reasons that catapulted Black Lives Matter into the public consciousness have disappeared. According to the Washington Post, there were 491 fatal shootings in the first 6 months of this year. How many, does anyone know how many there were in the first 6 months of last year, the last year of Obama's presidency? I don't expect you to. It was 465. So in other words, there have been more in the first 6 months under Trump than the first equivalent 6 months last year. And you look at the politics that he has, the policies that he's tried to introduce in the first 6 months. What are the headline ones? The ban on Muslims entering the United States and the repeal of Obamacare. Now, however timid and inadequate Obamacare's healthcare reforms were, they did provide some measure of healthcare insurance for poor people. The Washington-based Economic Policy Institute estimated that under the proposals that Trump introduced, 30 million Americans, the hugely disproportionate number of blacks you imagine within that figure, 30 million, twice the previous number, would lose their access to healthcare insurance. So all the more reason for black people to renew their efforts to struggle against his presidency. But what has happened? I think in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of Trump winning the presidency, it was very encouraging to see Black Lives Matter activists playing a prominent role in the development of the women's marches that we saw countering Trump's inauguration. And one of the speakers on those platforms was the legendary activist Angela Davis, and it's worth quoting what she said in her speech. I may need a couple of extra minutes. The next 1,459 days of the Trump administration will be 1,459 days of resistance. Resistance on the ground, resistance in the classrooms, resistance on the job, resistance in our art and music. This is just the beginning. And in the words of the inimitable Ella Baker, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We have to have resistance to Islamophobia, to anti-Semitism, to misogyny, to capitalist exploitation. Very fine words indeed. Sadly, I think the reality is that rather than really capturing that spirit and building on that movement, Black Lives Matter seems, at least temporarily, to have gone into decline and to be involved in all sorts of internal wranglings. The great challenge was to turn, if you like, those demonstrations, a Black Lives Matter moment, into a Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on all of the developments that there have been in America, but I would encourage you to read a very interesting article that came out just a couple of weeks ago on the BuzzFeed news website entitled "What Happened to Black Lives Matter?" And what it talks about is the way in which there's people who were involved in those fantastic protests feel as if it's losing traction, losing direction, losing momentum, and is being caught up in a whole series of internal debates and discussions about whether it should be a national movement or an international movement. Is Black Lives Matter an umbrella under which different relatively autonomous groups organise themselves? What is the relationship between the national leaders and local groups? What's the role of non-black people? Is it focused on policy, and if so, which policies, which policy makers? How can it influence the democratic debate? How can it influence the Democratic Party? One of the initial founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, received a howl of abuse when she said before the last election that she wouldn't support Hillary Clinton because look at the policies that her husband, Bill Clinton, introduced when he was president. Far from being the first black president, probably the only black thing that he did was play jazz saxophone. He himself introduced many of the policies that toughened sentences for black communities. So there are all sorts of, it would appear, internal tensions, which means that far from having a visible and vocal presence on the streets and in communities, Black Lives Matter seems to some extent to have gone into a level of decline. How can it be resolved? And I should begin to wind up here. It might sound glib, me standing here in a hot room in London, thousands of miles away, to argue that the way forward lies in building class unity along racial lines. In a society as segregated as the United States, such unity is by no means automatic, but it is possible, and it has always been possible from the communist-led struggles in Harlem and Alabama in the early 20th centuries through to the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. There are moments when you see unity between black and white people, and there is every reason why there should be unity across racial lines. You look at the statistics I mentioned earlier, and yes, disproportionate numbers of black people have been the victims of police assassinations. But last year, 387 white people, 130 Hispanics died as well. According to Taylor in her book, she cites a poll from the Huffington Post which reports that 19 million Americans, white Americans, twice the number of blacks, 19 million white Americans fell below the poverty line over the last 20 years. So every reason, and the healthcare reforms that I mentioned that Trump wants to introduce will be a catastrophe, not just for poor black Americans, but for poor white Americans. So there is every reason why people should unite. Is there any indication that this is happening? And again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in these things, nor am I going to suggest that the American working class is some, lean, mean, fighting machine, just, champing at the bit to take on the ruling class. According to, the leading confederation, a union confederation, the AFL-CIO, they have 14.6 million members, just 10.7% of the American working class, 10% down from 1983. But that does not mean that US workers are incapable of fighting. I don't have time to go into it. I really do need to wind up. So I will just give a very quick plug for the article that Julie Sherry has written in the International Socialism Journal that's just come out, which talks about the fast food riots movement and highlights the fact that 19 million workers across America have fought for and won $61.5 million worth of rises in their income since their campaign began in some of the most difficult to organise industries in America, the likes of McDonald's and so on. Unquestionably, those struggles will have involved black and white and workers of all different backgrounds. And moreover, you read the article, it's clear that they haven't simply focused upon economic conditions, but have made the links with the Black Lives Matter and other struggles. So it is the case that there is every possibility that those kind of struggles can be built, and through that a revival of the issues that Black Lives Matter has highlighted and the potential and possibility of real and lasting change.
Hi. Now I wanted to come back to the thing that Brian was talking about what the situation with the people who actually benefited from the civil rights and the Black Power movement is, the new black middle classes that have risen up, and their attitude, which I think is something that shows a lot of the divisions that now exist, and why the idea of just black people uniting can be a real problem. Because there is the thing, I suppose it's an attitude that says, we're doing all right, we aren't suffering from racism all the time, so you people, that's the mass of people, the poor people, shouldn't really be complaining about it, and you shouldn't be seeing that this is a problem. And I think this is something that came out with something that President Obama said when he was still in, when he was still president, when he spoke at the commencement for a college, Morehouse College, which was a traditional black college in Atlanta in 2013, where he said, oh, it's just disappeared. All right. He said in his speech, "We've got no time for excuses. Not because the bitter legacies of slavery and segregation have vanished entirely, they have not. Not because racism and discrimination no longer exist. We know that those are still out there. It's just that in today's hyper-connected, hyper-competitive world, with millions of young people from China and India and Brazil, many of whom started with a whole lot less than you all did, all of them entering the global workforce alongside you, nobody is going to give you anything that you have not earned." Now, his point here is to say to poorer black people, tough. You know, you can't raise racism and say that this is an issue. If you're saying that it's something that's holding you back, all you've got to do is actually try a bit harder, pull your socks up, and then you can rise up to the same level as the rest of us. And I think that this is a real problem, because this is something we've seen. I've seen similar arguments used in Britain, where people have been to black meetings where people have said, we can't complain about racism anymore, it's down to our community to pull our socks up. And I think this is a real problem, because this isn't a matter about saying there aren't problems within black communities, or there aren't problems with people who might not be pulling their weight or whatever, but the real problem, as I think Brian showed quite conclusively, with what the issues with black people, is the problem of racism. And if you accept this thing that we can't make excuses, it's saying you can't use racism as an excuse. Complaining about racism, saying that black people are held back, it's not making excuses, it's complaining about the fact that we live in a racist society and we need to do something about it.
Okay, I've got a few people putting their hands up, so just bear with me. I'll take the man in the blue shirt next.
Yeah. Just very short. I mean, we had Bernie Sanders, enormous success, and then it seems to have basically fizzled out from looking from afar. Yeah, and one of the problems is that he was working within the Democratic Party structures. So what are the I don't see how this unity is going to really happen without a revolutionary party at its core. And what are the prospects of building such a party, and what are the prospects of comrades here who happen to have contacts in the US of trying to argue for that perspective of a revolutionary party?
Okay, thank you. After this man will be the woman, yes, you.
Thank you, Brian. I was so impressed, to listen to his brilliant presentation, that every single word he uttered has its own life to live, and I don't find anything to take away. But I would struggle to add something to the last point you made. regarding the redefinition of, the slogan, Black Lives Matter to Black Life Movement, that is fine for me, because I have had issues trying to look at the whole slogan of Black Lives Matter as narrowly defined within a particular racial context, which has to do with the black race. Because I have seen instances where the black people, in what I call black on black violence, okay, they turn on each other, one another, as the case may be. And in reference to that, if you read Mahmoud Mamdani's book, When Victims Become Killers, okay, in the book, he tries to argue, in relation to the Central African crisis, particularly the 1994 Rwandan genocide, when African scholars were pointing fingers at the United Nations that had the power at the time to prevent the impending genocide, but failed to do so. And superpowers like America had to pick her citizens out of the troubled zone to save their own citizens' life, and allowed the Hutus and Tutsis to carry on with the massive violence that claimed hundreds of lives within 2 weeks. And that has been recorded by the United Nations as one of the worst genocides in human history after the Holocaust. So looking at the idea of Black Life Movement is brilliantly fine, by me, to replace the idea of all Black Lives Matter. Because if we are to go by that, then I would opt for the concept of universal humanism, that all lives, matter. Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by thanking Brian for a really inspiring and really informative presentation. I've looked at the Black Lives Matter movement and was incredibly inspired by that as well. The violence and racism that people have challenged in the richest country in the world, I thought fantastic that people have found their courage and new and innovative ways of challenging, the general accepted view that, there is a problem maybe in some of these communities. Now, I think inspiration is all very well, and I think, yes, there's a debate about where that movement goes, but we're all here because we believe in political ideas and shaping and changing our future. And I think we need to look at, yes, this is inspiring, now what can we do? We've seen really great writers, really great thinkers who've challenged the whole idea about guns in American society, that they've got a settler mentality that has created conditions which means you can criminalise a whole community. Yes, there are problems within those communities, but as socialists, as revolutionaries, we must not fall for the issue of blaming people for their own oppression. My parents come from a West Indian island which is incredibly violent, incredibly brutal. This is a country that does not create and make any guns, but that society was flooded with guns for political reasons in the 70s. Now, I think you've got to look at the poverty, the lack of employment, the lack of opportunity that has created a society in lots of West Indian islands where people see their only choice as going to another nation, going to a developed country in order to help and make their lives better in some way. Now, I think we need to take from the slogan, Black Lives Matter, what we do matters. The way we can show solidarity is by fighting where we are. There are massive deaths in custody in this country, and you will see revolutionary socialists, members of the SWP, often fighting those campaigns alongside people and supporting them in order to ensure that there is justice, so we can expose what the state has done, what the corrupt and racist police have done. That's what socialists do, and if you aren't members, that's why I would encourage you to join. What we do matters. We're not just here to talk, we're not just here to preach at people about how things are done. We're here for activity, we're here to make change, and we can do that. We're the people that have got the arguments that can challenge the guns in American society. Where is that violence coming from? This violence is systematic, this violence and racism is used to divide us, and it's used to control us. It's no coincidence that in one of the most racist societies in the world, when I spoke to my American cousins, they talked about how in the 30, 40 years they've been in America, how real wages for them and the people they know have fallen, so that people are earning minimum wage, if that, when 30, 40 years ago they were earning more money. That's the kind of conditions that create this violence, that mean you have to talk about your humanity. Our humanity means we have to show solidarity, we have to fight where we are, we have to hope and try and inspire people across the world with what we do here as well.
Okay, I'll take you this one, and then Wayman.
I'm sure that Brian will talk about Rwanda as a horribly barbaric example of Western imperialism tearing a country apart and setting people against one another, as they've been doing in Iraq and in the Middle East, and that prior to which people were able to find ways of living collectively. But the point I wanted to make was that in the United States, I'm from Canada, but I've lived in the United States as well, the root of contemporary racism is residential segregation. Black people cannot buy houses in white areas. The real estate agents won't sell them, the banks won't lend them the money. They are forced to live in segregated, racially segregated areas where the quality of the schools is based on the income of the people. So the schools are definitely inferior. They lack textbooks, many teachers won't teach there because it's so depressing. The kids are treated from day one as if they have no future, that the best they can do is work at McDonald's. In fact, from the moment a black child is born in the United States, first of all, they have a higher child and maternal mortality rate. They're more likely to be born premature because their mothers live with the constant assault of racism. Even in the professional class, they are more likely to have complications around birth. And then from every moment afterwards, where they live, where they go to school, where they work, they're clearly second-class citizens, clearly treated as they don't matter. And to say that Black Lives Matter is a direct challenge to that system of lack of worthiness of black people or immigrants, or people who are not considered, white, middle, upper class. So I think it's really important. I mean, it is in the workplace. It is in the low-wage working class fight for dignity that I think that we're going to see that interracial class solidarity, and and not to mention the historic roots of racism, where the black GIs coming back from the war did not get the benefits. We're not allowed to partake of the benefits for all kinds of systemic reasons that the white GIs got, the university educations, the housing and so forth. And then in the last recession, wiped out whatever little bit of equity that black families had managed to achieve, sent them right back, so that they've never been allowed to get ahead. And that's important for the ruling class in the United States because that's a source of tremendous wealth, not only in their exploitation as workers, but in the vast expanding prison slave population that works for nothing.
Thank Brian for his talk. I went to Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed, and also went to the funeral. And part of that, when you joined the Ferguson demonstration, what was interesting about the Ferguson riots was actually they were very multiracial. It was true that it was led by black people, but Hispanic people were on there, white people were on there, and it reflected what was going on. But I never trusted Obama from the day he came in, and I'll tell you why. In 2000, I went to a rally in America where he stood against a guy called Bobby Rush, who was a former Black Panther in America, and his speech was, we've got to move from protesting into being a position of power, and he attacked the civil rights movement and what it stood for. And part of that contradiction has always been, there's an argument about black leadership about how do you get on. Actually, the neoliberal acceptance is part of the reason why they've brought off whole layers of people in order to do that. But something else is changing in America. They don't deliver. Just as much as they don't deliver here, they don't deliver there. There's been, of the deaths that are in custody, of the people that have been murdered, not one single police officer has gone to jail, even though it's been clearly open murder. And it causes a contradiction in the American state. Actually, it causes a contradiction here. I find it amazing that Edison was murdered by 6 police officers inside Stratford, and when in Finsbury Park, when 600 people grab hold of someone, they take him alive. But when 5 or 6 coppers grab hold of someone, he's dead. There's something fundamentally wrong, and people can see it. You can lie under capitalism sometimes, but when people keep turning up dead, and there's no thing that comes out, there's a contradiction about how the state works and how it runs. And the argument, you can simply change that. To be honest, I keep being asked to join the Labour Party. My friends, Jeremy Corbyn asked me, Diana, please join, you could do so much, you could build whatever. And I keep asking them one simple question: do you think that will change if you become the Home Secretary? I think you would challenge it, but Obama, think about Obama. Actually, Obama cried at all those funerals. But actually, the Commander-in-Chief could not stop the American police force from killing people, even though it was wrongful. And that's part of the question about how do you actually get real change. I think America is on the verge of an explosion. People look at Trump, but Trump's a reflection of that. Trump's speeches have been, it reflects some of the changes that's happened to the white working class. Wages have been cut down to the lowest they've been. In fact, American workers are working harder than they've ever worked, before and they're not getting a return of it. Every single time there's been a movement against racism, there's been a backlash against it. In the civil rights movement, actually, there was a split between black and white workers because, you know, there was a division between it. Actually, Hispanic, black and white workers have a much more common process because of the attacks on neoliberalism. And when Frederick Douglass said they used racism to divide each, to conquer both, it's true, it's always been true of America. The first revolts in America were the Bacon revolts because the ruling class was afraid that black and white workers, black and white people would make a common connection and they wanted to break it. There's a tradition that runs there from the CIO all the way through to the 30s, to the civil rights movement. It's a tradition that we can build on. There's a gulf of politics. I'll just end up very quickly on this. The hardest thing in the Black Lives Matter movement was the idea that power was diffused and that by arguing hard enough, you'll get justice. That's actually not true. And we argued in the meeting, actually, the power in society is concentrated in the state. The only way to break the state is if people came together and broke it and fought for a better society that broke away from racism. This has been the stumbling block for the black movement, for the Black Panthers, for all the civil rights movement. It's always been the question of how you link class and race together and why you have to fight for an alternative. I think there's a potential to that because that's becoming much more commonplace. I'm going to shut up now. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about, you know, how the movement had gone. Maybe some people haven't seen all the details of it and the nature of how inspiring it was. I mean, Brian mentioned the protests were inspiring, but there was Ferguson, clearly the initial outbreak, and the fact that hundreds of people gathered in the town to protest after the killing, you know, and a lot of the particular details about what happened when Michael Brown was killed were sort of ones that really inflamed the emotions of people. There was all these arguments about the fact the police left his body in the street for 4 hours on a hot summer's day, and people wrote articles about, you know, only dictatorships leave bodies in the street. It's like the body is left in the street as an example, as well as a symbolic humiliation for the family and the whole community. And that's the level of anger which led to the big spark of Ferguson itself. But it really did explode. And I mean, you know, you had situations where, for example, you know, when Errol Garner was killed, that people mentioned, you know, immediately the demonstration that followed, that had apparently over 100,000 people going through the streets of New York. Again, you can see it on YouTube and stuff like that. Huge, very mixed too. Yes, black dominated in terms of people there, but loads of white people there too. Very, very good challenge to the establishment. And I think possibly in some ways, in a mass sense, the most impressive was the riots in Baltimore following the death of Freddie Gray, who was killed in this thing called a rough ride, where basically the police throw you in the back of the police van and then drive it deliberately in such, you know, all over the place. They're seated up with their seatbelts on, but you're being thrown literally like this. Your bones are being broken, etc. They'd already had to pay out millions in compensation in Baltimore police for doing this to 2 previous black people over the last decade, and Freddie Gray died as soon as they hauled him out after that 45-minute rough ride. But you know, 100,000 people protested in Baltimore. That's a city of only maybe 500,000-600,000. So you know, that was a really big-scale protest. Just the last question, which I guess is, it's right for us to be discussing the problems that maybe some of the elements of are having about what to go now, but surely in lots of ways they have set the stage for the mass protests that we've seen under Trump, which have been so inspiring as well.
I want to come back on the speaker and contributor who said, where's the upsurge around Bernie Sanders gone, and what's our role actually in influencing, if we can, the American left. I think, you know, the issue about whether we can get a movement that is class-based and is actually going to challenge the means of production and actually strengthen and use our muscle as an industrial way is a really, really important one. And what we seem to have seen in the US and other places is that the upsurge of activity around the Occupy movement, around a number of other street-based movements, in America there's been a whole range of things, from women's movements on campuses, Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, which has been unparty political and suspicious of party and organisation, has actually ended up sort of, on one analysis, being pushed towards the democratic structures of left reformism and Bernie Sanders and so on. I think that to say that the thing's gone down is to misread it, because actually there's a space there in America where, if you look at what's going on with the fast food rights campaign, there are lots of the same community organisers, people who are becoming leaders in their own right and working inside now movements like, I think there is a big crossover with the fast food rights campaign, and beginning to win serious gains, because the contradiction of the Trump election was that a whole number of states in America won $15 an hour, on the people voted for that and so forth, and what we can do here is to spread that. That's spreading over here in terms of the McDonald's campaign here. On the 4th of September there's going to be an international day of action around that, and that is a serious class-based thing, with black and white working together. It's the same issue here, it's about race as well, it's about whether or not migrants are going to be sent back, because lots of people working at McDonald's here are European migrants and so on, that we can link up those struggles and actually, our job in Britain is to make sure that we challenge. They're looking here to see what's happening with Corbyn, that can't just be a left reformist challenge in a parliamentary sense, it has to get on to an industrial struggle, and us doing that here in the UK is the best way to influence the debate in America.
Yeah, I think I just want to speak about the links between different organisations in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson. I'm not sure if it was Ferguson, but people linked up with people in Palestine and made a connection between police violence and how the states would use violence against them to oppress. And you also see that in terms of the Black Panther movement, how they linked up with the LGBT community and showed a sense of solidarity. When there's a mass movement, people show solidarity to other groups and understand that it's the state against them and not them against each other, the division. And I think people speak about, in order for racism to be to get over it, we have to have black faces in high places. But then in Africa, a continent full of black faces in high places, and it's like it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to change anything. People have to have that class analysis and understand that the sense of unity is going to be much stronger. But I had something else that I completely forgot. But I think Marx spoke about racism in terms of the English proletariat and the Irish proletariat, and you clearly saw that with in South America, the southern part of America, when the blacks and whites were kind of against each other. They both had a lower wage compared to those in North America, the blacks and white that were working together in trade union. It shows that if you work together in a sense of class and unity, regardless of your colour or your skin, and you can fight against the state and make sure that your way of living is better, and you're not divided and turned against each other for unnecessary reasons.
Thanks, Sabra, and thanks, comrades, for I think an excellent discussion. I'm glad that someone raised the question of Bernie Sanders, because of course the huge upsurge of enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign last year was the other great thing that we saw alongside the Black Lives Matter protests. And the fact that someone who called himself a socialist, whatever kind of contradictions there are in Bernie Sanders' politics, the fact that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people rallied to his idea is, I think, another indication that ordinary people who have suffered under neoliberalism for decades are looking for an alternative and can be part of a radical and exciting alternative. And of course, there are some commentators who say that had Sanders been the presidential candidate, the Democrats moved everything that they could to prevent him being the candidate and ensured that Hillary Clinton was the candidate. That had Sanders been the presidential campaign, then he may well have beaten Donald Trump, and what an exciting possibility that would have been. And it's right, as Tom and others have said, that the networks that were involved in Sanders' campaign, that have been involved in Black Lives Matter, haven't simply gone away. And I really would urge, it's a very short article, but the fact that it does talk about the fast food riots, and it does talk about how the people who were involved in the fast food riots campaign have explicitly associated their struggle for better pay with the wider struggles to end racism and to end other forms of oppression is hugely important. It is important to acknowledge that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, at least two of the three main founding organisers of that, identify themselves as being queer women. They have a background themselves in community campaigns and politics, and therefore they encouraged that wave of protest, that magnificent wave of protest. Hundreds of thousands of people in cities across America that completely outflanked Trump's inauguration at the beginning of January. Those movements haven't simply gone away. The challenge is to turn those networks into a fighting movement, and crucially, of course, to break the links that there still are between the likes of Sanders and the Democratic Party, and the idea that the way forward is trying to enter into a system in which the main parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are essentially Tweedledee and Tweedledum. In that context, therefore, it's good to see Bernie Sanders has just got a book out. He's been touring that book around. I know that he came to London and spoke at Brixton Academy, just where I live in South London. It was a packed meeting, during which he said that he was excited at the success of Jeremy Corbyn and looks forward to coming back to Britain when Jeremy Corbyn's the Prime Minister. And so there are interesting links that can be made there. I want to finish where I think Theresa rightly talked about what can we do in this country, because the purpose of meetings like this, the purpose of Marxism, isn't simply to commentate on things that are happening afar, but to talk about what we can do to build struggles and solidarity here. And in that context, it's important that we don't simply lecture America about the shortcomings of their movement and what they need to do, but we talk about what we need to do in this country as well. And therefore, it isn't the case that deaths in custody happen on the same scale is in America. It'd be ridiculous to say that, but deaths in custody certainly do happen in this country. We know the names: Joy Gardner, Cherry Gross, Cynthia Jarrett, Roger Sylvester, Smiley Culture, Mark Duggan, and Wayman mentioned right at the end of his contribution the most recent example. Just a couple of weeks ago, Edson DaCosta, whose relatives came and spoke at our opening rally on Thursday night, talked about how he died at the hands of the police in Forest Gate just a couple of weeks ago. I believe they're here again today. Damian Atkinson, once a famous professional footballer, the fact that he was a famous professional footballer didn't stop him being tasered to death by the police in the West Midlands last year. And of course there are wider issues of institutional racism that are raised, disproportionate levels of stops and search, educational exclusion, criminalisation, incarceration and so on. All of those things happen here and are injustices that we should fight against. And it's for that reason that I was very proud to participate in the Black Lives Matter protests that occurred in this country last year, in London, in Liverpool, in Manchester, and so on. And those were protests not simply as acts of solidarity, copycat demonstrations because of what happened in America. It was clear from the speeches that were delivered on those demonstrations and the reception that those speeches received on those demonstrations that people are clear that atrocities and injustices occur in this country as well, and that they are injustices and atrocities that we have to fight against. And the thing that inspired me as much as anything else was the fact that those protests, both in America and the protests here, weren't simply black people demonstrations, but were united demonstrations, black and white, overwhelmingly young people marching together, and marching together with a real and clear understanding of the injustices that occur as well. And I know it's a little thing, but it's a little thing that I think that mattered so much. I remember one Sunday as we marched spontaneously down Oxford Street, just down the road from here, one of the main shopping streets in central London, stopping the traffic, preventing the buses from moving. What did the bus drivers do? Did they toot their horns in anger against us? No, they tooted their horns and raised their fists and bumped fists with us in solidarity with us, recognising the reasons why we were demonstrating. And if you see that, a small indication of bus workers with an immense amount of power showing their solidarity with us. That kind of solidarity and those kind of struggles that we have to build on. If you think of the most recent horrific thing that we've seen in this country, the burning down of Grenfell Towers, and that is an atrocity that will have seen people from all different communities, black, white, immigrant communities, people born in this country, suffering together in the richest borough in this country, an absolute disgrace, and we have to build solidarity with those people, again, people who came and spoke at our opening rally. It's in that sense that you take a specific issue, Black Lives Matter, and show that your solidarity with the struggles against those specific forms of oppression are linked to the wider oppression and exploitation and destruction of the lives of working class people that we all experience under capitalism. And so therefore, we're not simply, a meeting like this, an event like Marxism, is not just intended to commentate on things that are happening afar, but to enable us to discuss concretely how we build movements against the oppression and exploitation that we experience here. So the best thing that we can do in this country to inspire and build solidarity with people in America and so on is to build the campaign for justice for the Grenfell residents and the local community, to build the struggles against deaths in custody over here, but also I think to build upon the fantastic wave of energy and excitement that we saw around the general election and around the manifesto that Jeremy Corbyn launched. We have seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks or so a significant leftward shift in British politics. By contrast, if you think we were told, weren't we, in the aftermath of the referendum last year, that what we were witnessing in Britain was a wave of racist reaction, the rise of racism, an increase in racism that showed that Britain was perhaps an irretrievably toxic racist society. We cannot afford to be complacent about the question of racism. I was in Stratford just on Tuesday, partly in solidarity with the victims of the deaths in custody, but partly also on a vigil against the horrific acid attacks upon a young Muslim couple, and we've seen attacks on mosques, the attack on Finsbury Park Mosque, and violent attacks on Muslim women and so on. We've seen the very dangerous prospect of a revival of racism through the march that was organised by this newly formed group, the Football Lads Alliance, just a couple of weeks ago. Thousands of people marching in London on a demonstration at which I'm sure not all of the people on that demonstration were racist, but certainly the leaders of that demonstration and the people who spoke at that demonstration were saying explicitly racist and Islamophobic things. Those are dangerous currents. They're an indication of the divisions that exist in circumstances like those that we're living in. But the flip side of that is the shift leftwards that was reflected in the votes that millions of people were prepared to give to Jeremy Corbyn. We need to build on that, but I would argue go beyond that and build a revolutionary struggle that puts an end to oppression and exploitation once and for all.